All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting for January 23 or 24, depending on the time zone you're in. Thanks to everyone for showing up. Again, this is a standard Kubernetes community meeting, so all the same guidelines apply. We have a Kubernetes code of conduct that could generally be summarized as just be nice to each other. Nothing too out of the ordinary there. I will say, this agenda is open. Anybody should be able to add things to it. That's by design. So if you have something that you'd like to bring up, please, by all means, add it to the list. Maybe mention it in chat, whatever's easiest for you, and we'll try and get to it. I think we should have time with today's agenda, but I'm always a terrible predictor of how long we'll spend on topics. So with that, I don't know. I can't tell. Is Arco here today? Not yet, it looks like. So maybe I think I'll take this one. Anyways, I would like to do a 061 release. There were some validation fixes that got in recently that I would like to release, and there have been some good conformance test updates. I don't see any reason not to do an 061, but I'll defer. I don't know, Nick, Shane.
I agree.
Any reason not? Okay.
Yeah, we already had a milestone for it too.
Yeah. Maybe we can try and do that in the next couple of weeks. I don't know. I don't have a firm idea on timeline, but there are a sufficient number of things out there that they seem worth releasing. I don't know of anything that's just on the horizon that would be useful to add. I don't know.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I guess I saw that Candace's TLS route, the initial conformance test, is merged, so that would probably be nice to get in. But there's a bunch of other. Basically, I think any conformance test or validation updates we should pull in.
Yep.
Might just be a matter of creating backport issues for all of them.
Yep.
So if you have something that you would like included in the 061 release, then please feel free to create a backport issue that says please backport this thing to 061, and then we can put it in the milestone, and then we can have a burn down list.
Yep. Well said. Cool. Okay. With that, I think Shane, you're up next.
Yeah, sorry in advance if I sound crummy. I'm not feeling great today. So for those who don't know, Blixt is a reference and testing implementation of Gateway API that uses eBPF for the data plane. We have been working on it since about KubeCon. It is being transferred to Kubernetes SIG, so I just wanted to give a quick status update because a few things have happened. First of all, it's been mostly accepted, except we're going through CNCF legal review because of the use of GPL2. So it's just kind of waiting for them to accept GPL2 or ask us to do some kind of dual licensing schema with GPL2 that will suit them, but eventually should go through since there's already precedent with Cilium. The current status of functionality is we're getting really close to our first milestone in our first release, which will be UDP route support at a basic level. Once we do that, we kind of expect that we're probably going to be able to at least start plugging it, probably be able to plug it into the Gateway API repo at a very, probably mostly like a skeleton and like scaffolding and all of that, and maybe like a couple of specific conformance tests just to get the groundwork for like running it on PRs in there. And then we are getting close to TCP support. We have completed some of the egress work that we need to make that happen. And there's an open PR that's a WIP that Andrew and I are working on right now to kind of get the groundwork laid for that. And then ultimately, we started doing the Gateway API code jam as part of an effort to just have some time to do more like paired programming stuff for Gateway API, but it's mostly been focused on Blixt, and it probably will be for the near term. So on Fridays, we've been doing that and the attendance has been really good. If you're interested in working on Blixt, that is a great place. It's on the SIG Network calendar to kind of just join in. It's not recorded. It's just kind of for fun. It's still under like the community code of conduct, but it's a very relaxed place to come talk about the project and maybe just do some live coding and stuff. So.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for the update. Very cool to see Blix coming along, and it will be great to work this into our conformance tests and really have kind of a good implementation. So we have a bit more of a feel on any kind of pain points, especially at L4 that we might run into along the way. So yeah, awesome. Any last bits on that, or should we keep on moving?
Go ahead, unless somebody has
Great.
questions.
Okay. All right. So I shared this doc with community on Slack and mailing list, I don't know, a week and a half ago, I want to say, but we haven't had any kind of formal agenda-driven meeting since then. So chances are you've probably looked at this. I don't know, but I'll provide a little bit of an overview since we haven't had a chance to discuss it in a meeting yet. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is how on earth we go to GA. What does it look like for Gateway API to have alpha, beta, and GA API versions? And how can we do that in a way that is maintainable, sustainable, and just not, ridiculous overhead for implementers, users, and the rest? You can also see I linked out to a related doc that Tim has, where he's also Tim Hawken has written a doc that's more broad, and it's talking about potential changes we could make to alpha, beta, GA cycle in Kubernetes as a whole. But because we as Gateway API exist ever so slightly outside of that, we have a little bit more flexibility in what we do. And I have a proposal here, and this is very much still a proposal. This is not approved or anything. This is just my perspective. One, I think that wherever possible, we should remove the concept of beta from Gateway API. I think in general, there are two states in Kubernetes APIs. There is the on by default and stable state, and there is the off by default and unstable state. Beta has always existed in this kind of weird in between of, in some cases, on by default, less so, and somewhat stable, but not as stable as stable. And my argument is that maybe we just have the two states. This largely maps with what we already have in Gateway API. We have a standard channel and experimental channel. It's really just saying those will be our only channels, and we'll call what we have in standard GA at some point in the future. And anything else will just have to meet a higher bar to get to that standard channel, and that will become GA. That is my idea. The reason behind this is that every new API version adds significant cost, whether it's to maintainers, to implementers, or to users. We have dealt with this. If you've worked with Kubernetes for any period of time, you have likely dealt with the pain of version compatibility, trying to convince users to upgrade to the latest API version. Older API version gets dropped. It's a mess. And then with CRD specifically, this is just some slides from KubeCon Contrib Summit talk I gave. The idea is that if we do things properly, every API version goes through this 4 release cycle. And so this kind of highlights what we've done with Gateway API already. But if you can imagine that for every API version, it needs to run through 4 different minor releases. That's, a real cost. And that's your best case scenario, where you get every little part of the process right. If you miss one in one release, then, okay, well, let's add 1 to that. 4 is really your best case scenario. Yeah, so a lot of thoughts written out about this. I want to just maybe open it up to some discussion around this here. There's Yeah. This does represent a big change. We would be the first official Kubernetes API to take this approach. I am interested in what others think. I know I'm not the only one who has dealt with Kubernetes versioning before. So, yeah.
If I can make a small comment, Java, servlets, Go, and pretty much everyone in the world has dealt with this problem and have maintained stable APIs with understanding that once you launch an API, it remains stable and you need to support it forever. I think it's a very good thing to take the same approach and not pretend that, hey, we can change the APIs and have people use it and then change our mind. And so this is a great idea if it comes with take responsibility for an API with expectations that once you put it in stable, it will never go away. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that is really just this recognition that once things graduated to beta effectively in Kubernetes, we weren't really meaningfully changing things. And when we did, we regretted it, at least speaking from personal experience. Yeah, so that's my perspective. Shane, I think you've got a hand.
It seems to me like one of the reasons why you would want the beta these days is the ostensibly so that you could say we are technically in production, but if we absolutely needed to make a breaking change, we're kind of telling people it's beta, we still might do it. Have we done that meaningfully recently? Like, what are some examples to talk about of like actually having done that recently? Because if there's basically none, I mean,
I am very familiar with the Ingress API and taking that from beta to GA and the mistakes made along the way, largely by myself. And I know that was a painful migration for everyone involved. And, I kind of alluded to it in retrospect. I wish we just hadn't made changes.
yeah, that was a while ago.
Yeah, and it was. And then endpoint slice, I'm very familiar with that. We did beta to GA. We were trying to get rid of a field in that transition that we didn't think we needed anymore. And we introduced a bug in that process. So again, I don't know that we added any value. So the 2 times I've seen changes, again, they were small, but changes between beta and GA, I'd say in both cases, they were regretted.
Yeah, my thinking is like, I remember those. I mean, I was working on clusters at the time, but my thinking is like, it leans towards if we're not able to actually get that value, then we don't need beta. But I also, counterpoint, have we actually exercised, like, is it possible that we just made other mistakes? It wasn't specifically because you can't make that work correctly. I don't know. That's all. I think I lean towards yes, get rid of beta. Seems fine. Seems to match up with how we're actually using versions. But I would be just a little cautious to like get rid of that potential benefit based on, this might be a simplification, but based on 2 experiences so far.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying. And I would say I still see there is some limited value in beta APIs. I just don't think that value outweighs the costs associated with that extra API version, because the costs are significant and guaranteed. The value is possible, but not guaranteed.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that the biggest cost, like one of the biggest costs is for implementers, right? Like you have to maintain separate type definitions, separate deserializations, and a lot of the times like separate watches and stuff like that for the different API versions. And so if you have 3 API versions, then that means, like if for some brief period of time you support all 3, that's 3 copies of a bunch of code essentially. I mean, a lot of the time you can get away with type switching and some type of conversion and stuff, but sometimes you can't, especially if you've made big changes between like alpha versions or something like that. That was what happened when we went from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2 for Gateway API. So I think I'm in favor of this because I think that it marks down what effectively has happened historically in the past with Ingress mainly, but with other APIs as well. Once it moves to beta, people are like, oh yeah, okay, this is probably stable enough to start using. But then once people are using it, then it's now stable enough that you can't change it anymore. Like, yeah, that's the problem, is that like beta is usually stable enough that some people will start using it, but once people are using it, if you change it, you break all the people who are already using it. And so like, and the best case is that you go, oh, okay, we need to make a breaking change. Now this is V1 beta 2. But then all the people who are still using V1 beta 1 now need to convert, or you need to build a conversion webhook, or you need to do something like every time you make one of those, like a version transition, that's not just, hey, this is working, and we need, like, if every time you do a deprecation and a removal cycle, like, it's a lot of work for everybody, users, maintainers, everybody, implementers, everybody. And so like, I think that removing the intermediary step of beta just makes it more clear that that's the case, that when an API leaves alpha, you are making API guarantees. Maybe, and I think that that maybe what we might need to do is just, if we do decide we've made a mistake with something that we've moved to GA, then we just be more aggressive about saying, okay, V2 alpha 1 it is, baby, right? Like, we just say, okay, we're making a breaking change, this is the next version of the API. And that's, breaking change equals API rev, and that's, that then becomes the norm, rather than, breaking change equals minor API version, essentially.
Yeah, I don't think I explicitly said that in here, but that's exactly what I'm saying. That, if we need to make an API change, that we go back to alpha, V2 alpha 1, whatever it is. That seems like the correct way to do that, instead of trying to make a change and still call it stable. After we've made
the important
that
clarification there is breaking API change.
Yes.
Additive AP compatible API changes are okay. Additive compatible API changes are defined in the API conventions. They are the result of like long, hard-won experience by a lot of people. And so I think that's the really relevant thing.
Yeah, I still tend towards too. So, I mean, I was trying to convince myself just to have an argument, but I still lean towards we should just do it.
Cool. Anyone, any other perspectives here? I will take silence as agreement right now. I did ask, or go ahead.
Sorry. I think you mentioned in the beginning that we would be the first Kubernetes component to do this. Could we be the second instead?
Yeah, I know. I would love to be the second in many things. It would make life a lot easier. But just the very nature of Gateway API, it seems like we've been paving a path for many things. One of the first major APIs to use CRDs to begin with. That's official Kubernetes thing, and I think by very nature we're running into some of these other problems first too, and trying to come up with solutions that make sense. I was talking with Tim about this, Tim Hawken, about this as well, and he has been supportive of the idea, and the guidance that I've heard from that perspective is just, we are, for better or worse, we are the ones that get to try things out in the community first, and provide. We're the guinea pigs, I guess. We get to see if this idea makes sense, and if it does, I expect others will adopt it. And if it doesn't, well, we've learned the hard lesson. But I'm hopeful that it will. But yeah, and on that note, I would say, I was also asking around, like, what does it? We're kind of in this unique place where it's unclear what kind of approvals we really need to make this change. SIG Network seems to be okay with this, but got a suggestion that we really should bring this to SIG Arch as well. So this got sent out to both SIG Arch and SIG Network mailing lists. I have not received any pushback, but I want to explicitly raise this on an agenda, get a discussion going. So that is on a SIG Arch agenda for this week, January 26th, if anyone wants to attend. And that, depending on the feedback there, will be our final go or no go, I expect, on this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just wanted to put that out there. See how it
It,
whether
it is
bounced
a
back or
very
not.
reasonable, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've been out in front for so long now that we are kind of stuck here as the people out in front, trying all this stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah, good questions. Next up, let me run into, I think a lot of our stuff is kind of starting to bleed into other SIGs a bit. And this is another example of that. As I think we've discussed before, reference grant has been used by SIG storage now, which is awesome. But it means that there is some onus on us and SIG storage to work together to pull reference grant into some kind of neutral home. SIGAuth has been receptive to that idea. And so we created a KEP. Nick and I have written this up to describe what that would look like. There has been all kinds of good feedback. And although SIGAuth reviewed the initial reference grant API when we were designing it to begin with, we're getting some really good questions now that we can't just, in the initial reference grant design, we could just say, well, we have two very clear use cases and they look exactly like this, and therefore reference grant makes sense. Now we have to deal with a little bit more of the unknown of reference grant needs to be sufficiently generic that it can work in many cases. So really good feedback, really good questions. It's going to take some time to respond to the feedback we already have. But if anyone wants to help out with this, I know very welcome to join the conversation, help with the KEP, whatever is helpful. I think we've got around 2 weeks left until the upstream KEP free. So that means in the next couple of weeks, we're trying to get this merged, but there are still some large open questions on this one. Nick, I know you have touched this most recently. Are there any specific things you want to highlight on it?
No, I think the SIGAuth folks have had, I tried to address a bunch of the questions that they raised earlier when you presented this to them, but there's a couple of that I missed that Jordan has brought up. So yeah, I think I'm going to try and bring in some of the discussion there and answer it in comments, but then also bring it into the text to sort of, so there's a record of it. Yeah, I think, we've obviously got some feedback about, using kind instead of resource and a few other things, calls that we made that I think we've made the right call, but there are sort of corollaries to that are pretty reasonable that we need to make sure we've addressed in the KEP to make the behavior clear. I also think that it's very fair to say that we were aiming to be we're just going to take what we've got and move it into beta in this new thing. And I think Mo made the fair point that, this is the chance where you get this, you're moving it, so you get to make any changes you want to make. So I think we might end up, it feels like from the feedback that we're getting that we might end up making at least some changes. We need to go back and think about things like, do we have a namespace selector for the namespaces? Do we make it explicit that if we don't, that star is all namespaces, or that sort of stuff. Not huge changes, but changes nonetheless.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting comments, I don't remember all of them offhand, but because we're getting SIG author review on this, we're getting some, I think, really neat ideas. One of them, I think also from Mo, was the idea of can we create something that translates reference grants into RBAC basically, and creates and allows consumers of this API to just do a subject access review as a way of consuming the API. I'm not sure that would work, but it's, there are lots of good questions on here. So as much as I think both of us had hoped we could just take the existing API and move it over verbatim, getting good enough questions that we may need to reevaluate some bits as we go. So yeah.
As always, this is one of the reasons why KEPs can often take a while, is that sometimes it's the first time that people who know a lot about, have been doing Kubernetes API review for many years, have a look at something in depth, and then they're like, oh, what about this? What about this? Have you thought about this? And you're like, oh, those are all really good points that I never thought of.
Yep. Yep. Well said. Cool. All right, so I think that's all for reference grant. Again, if anyone has ideas, feel free to jump in. We are always looking for help to push this one forward. The next thing I kind of wanted to highlight before we get into triage here is just starting to think about our next release. I know at the end of last year, we kept on saying we want to do more smaller releases. So instead of just assuming that our next release will be, say, 4 months away, we may want to break that assumption and assume that our next minor release could be in a few weeks. I don't know that it should be in a few weeks, but sooner than we would traditionally think. With that in mind, I wanted to just jot some ideas down that I'm aware of, thinking about on the roadmap that could be part of another release, right? I know Gamma, well, maybe I think Mike, at least here on the call, I don't know if any other Gamma maintainers are here, but do we have any ideas what kind of timeline we're looking for, and, you know, when we might have something more concrete that we could bundle with a release from Gamma perspective?
So I think it would probably depend on wrapping up the outstanding issues in the milestone. That's probably the best, like, what's the content of what we want. We're pretty close to getting a substantial addition to the scope of the routing stuff merged. And there's a handful of edge cases that we'll probably just focus on, basically like routing only, but tie off the edge cases and make sure that that is in good shape for review is kind of the goal as far as content. I don't have a good answer as far as time at this point, but that's definitely something that we can bring up during the Gamma meeting tomorrow.
Yeah, no, that'd be good. I mean, let's just say that we are ready to release VO70 in 1 month from today. Just imagine, is that a, you know, and this is, I think, just a question for tomorrow, but is that something that we could possibly include something from Gamma? And again, you know, we're trying, I think all of our goals here are trying to make it less painful to miss a release. So if you miss a V070, it's not like you're waiting for 6 months or 8 months for 080 or 1.0, whatever. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I expect I'll be at the Gamma meeting tomorrow as well, so we can discuss this there. Just that's one of the things that's top of mind for me. Next up, GA for gateway class, HP route. This, you know, we've basically hit the criteria, I think, that we defined for ourselves in terms of what that means. I feel like the thing that we don't know yet is the outcome of this doc of, does beta still exist? So it basically, there's 2 separate paths. There's a path where we keep all API versions alpha, beta, GA, and then we have a experimental, standard, and stable channel of the API. So 3 release channels, 3, you know, I think at this point, I am personally leaning towards, you know, obviously the simpler option here, but until we know that, I think this is kind of stuck. We may know that as soon as January 26th, but yeah, I think whenever we do this GA, my vote would be that we call the API 1.0. So whenever we GA L7 resources is, yeah, okay, maybe not. But interested in what others think here. I don't know when we call this API 1.0 if it isn't that point.
I feel like 1.0 means that we have the TLS route, like the existing route types, possibly excluding gRPC route. Yeah, the sort of the ones that we started with, that those feel like the ones that we need to have the layer 4 ones and the layer 7 ones, you know, and TLS route, because it's not a clean layer, or the GA for us to call this API GA.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit, like just your thinking and reasoning?
So like, you know, I feel like saying Gateway API is GA when we've got gateway class and HTTP route, maybe. Then again, that depends on what we do with reference grant. I would say probably, yeah, again, if we're having a new reference grant in another API group that's alpha, like, a lot of what we do depends on having reference grant available. And so like if we're going to have another shared reference grant that's alpha, do we rely on that, or so there's some other stuff there. So I think it feels to me like Gateway API being 1.0 says this thing is like, this thing is definitely ready for like production use. This thing is definitely ready for, but are we going to say that this thing is ready for production use means, but only for HTTP? That's the thing.
I mean,
I'm like, when we say
We're
this
like
thing is ready
almost there right now.
Yeah, like I don't disagree that the HTTP stuff is ready for production use, but like, doesn't Gateway API also include layer 4 use cases? Like the words Gateway API, doesn't that include layer 4 use cases? If we say Gateway API is GA, should we include layer 4 use cases in that and TLS route? That's my only concern, is like, what do we mean when we say the API is 1.0? Like,
Right.
we just need to,
I mean, I agree. I wish that everything that we started with would end up being in the first 1.0. I also think the 1.0 is kind of feeling a little bit ceremonial.
Yeah, I mean, or go ahead.
And so, yeah, I mean, I would say 1.0 is ceremonial in some respects, but it's also not ceremonial in that it sends a signal to the world that, like it sends a signal to the world, this is ready to use, right? Like, we're not going to change this. Like the stableness is real. And so I mean, I think Bowie says in the chat, like, beta equals launch, right? Like, we all agree the beta resources we have in gateway class and HTTP route are ready to be marked as GA. I do not dispute that in the slightest. What I'm saying is, what does bumping the bundle version to 1.0 mean? And that's like that's the thing I'm talking about.
I think it's partially ceremonial, and I lean towards, we have a good chunk of functionality through the 4 APIs that we're talking about, that covers a very large percentage of what people are actually doing with the API. And I think we should just have that ceremony sooner rather than later. I'm leaning against it, Nick, to be honest. I kind of feel like if it is partially ceremonial, have the ceremony, say it's 1.0. The main benefit I think we're going to get from saying it's 1.0 is drawing more attention to ourselves, and drawing more attention to ourselves brings more people in, and more people in means we'll get more attention on things, and like things will hopefully move faster. So I see a benefit in just saying it's 1.0 now, because we feel confident in our most important, well, not most important, but some of our flagship APIs.
Yeah, I think my concern is anything below 1.0 in Semver does not invoke any term of stability. So if we're calling something stable, but still calling our released version O dot whatever, that feels to be, a conflict. And then there's so many different moving targets we could have. I think you brought up the most obvious one, like we should wait till L4 routes are GA. But then the next one is which L4 routes, what if TCP moves before UDP, before gRPC? Oh, not gRPC, not that L4, but just other route types, right? And then at the same time, there's other ideas like Gamma. Gamma is going to start experimental. You could potentially say, well, we should wait until that's ready.
I see what you're saying. Like I think that Travis asked a question in the chat that, is there anything in particular for the L4 APIs we'd want to be more stable? Yes, we have a checklist for them. We need conformance tests, we need implementation support, and we need to be confident that we don't need to add anything to those APIs. I feel like we haven't got any of those three things yet. We don't have conformance tests. We don't have good implementation support. Like, there are some implementations that support it, but without the conformance tests, like, what does support really mean? And then I personally do not feel comfortable with the L4 things that there's nothing that we'll need to add. People have definitely said that they want some sort of IP filtering functionality, but as when we added that before, like Tim raised a really good point that like that's kind of makes a gateway a firewall as well. And so we need to be clear about what, if we are adding that, what do these things mean and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of work to do for the L4 APIs, I think. And I think you're all right. Like I think, Rob, your point is probably the thing that sways me the most, that if we're going to call something stable, it makes sense for the API itself to have a 1.0 to be like, hey, some of this API is stable, right? There's experimental bits, but the stable bits are stable. And we mean stable. And the V1 API group also says that, right? Like when an API group goes to V1, that means that it is no longer alpha or beta, it is proper stable. It doesn't mean that we can't make compatible additive changes, which is what we are doing already. And that's what you're trying to say with the, phasing out beta anyway. It would be easier to phase out beta if we had no resources in beta. So like if we graduate all the resources that we know are good already to GA, call the bundle version whatever we want, and there is nothing in beta, then phasing out beta is all of a sudden a lot easier. So I guess this is me thinking out loud, but like I guess I kind of withdraw my objections. I think that probably makes sense that we say, hey, if we're going to GA any resources, that's when we do. If we're going to GA those three sort of early resources, then that's when we do 1.0. I do think that probably we should look at we do need to wait to decide on that to find out what happens with reference grant, because a lot of what we do is very dependent on reference grant or the idea of reference grant. And so, if that's going to go back to alpha, then maybe we want to hold on to the beta for a little bit until we can be confident that the reference grant is going to move through relatively quickly. But I think that's really my only concern at that point.
Yep. Yeah, I think those are all entirely fair points. So a lot of discussion there. I think my high level takeaways from this whole discussion are that yes, we do want gateway class and HTTP route to go to GA. When that happens, we'll probably call the API 1.0. We're waiting to see what happens with reference grant. We're waiting to see what happens with SIG Arch as far as this idea of removing beta. And at the same time, we want to keep on moving forward with other things. This does not need to block, 0.7.0. This is something that is probably going to sit for a little bit, even though we, by and large, have met the graduation criteria. We should wait till we have a very clear picture of what's happening with the reference grant, what's happening with API versioning, SIG Arch, and then we can come back to that. So with that said, that leads me to think that we have at least a V07.0 between us and GA. At least that. So on that note, let's talk about path redirects and rewrites. That's a gap that I started a while ago. It's sat and experimental for long enough. I think we have enough implementations of this now. Lior recently added conformance tests for, I think, the full set of functionality here, but I don't think those have been released. They're just sitting in the main branch, but they would be part of an 061 release. Has anybody, so maybe just a quick survey here of people that represent implementations here. Anyone out there that has implemented the features in this gap, specifically path redirects and any form of rewrite?
I actually can't remember if Cilium has or not. Sorry.
It's fine.
Yeah, I'll ask the engineering team on Envoy Gateway, and I can probably report back in the next day or two.
Great.
I've been trying to get one of them to start attending these regularly, but I'm still pushing on that.
Yeah. Maybe I'll follow up with a question in Slack or a GitHub discussion. It is until we have centralized conformance reporting, it is always difficult to know for sure who's actually implementing and using a thing. But my guess is that we probably have enough usage here or implementation to push this one forward relatively soon. I expect with no changes. So this feels like one of the most straightforward candidates to keep on moving in 070. At that point, it's just joining standard channel and joining beta for those features. But I'll follow up. The next one is policy attachment.
Before we open the policy attachment
Pandora's
box, we should consider Candace's question.
Yeah, that's a good one. Let me just add backend properties. That feels awfully close to TLS route, but no, I'll put it up here. Yeah, so anyone, Candace, maybe what do you think we need here? I know it's kind of gotten stuck, and we got stuck in a bunch of back and forth about what actually belongs in this resource. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I came to the agenda to just add it as something that we could reconsider, getting back into discussion again, because it's been a while since we actually looked at it. Well, it's been a while since we as a group looked at it, though I know that that Nick has been updating the document and other people have been looking at the document for the TLS use cases. And Nick is probably a better describer of what's happening. We pretty much have dropped the concept of backend properties, I think, and we're now moving into getting a better sense of the TLS use cases. Is that your impression, Nick?
Yeah, I think so. I think that backend properties was a little bit too generic. I think there's definitely a reasonably straightforward user requirement for the use case of my pod is already doing TLS and I want to be able to have ingress traffic to that pod to also do TLS, either in the forwarded TLS case or in the unzipped at the gateway and then re-encrypted use case. Like, that's a reasonably well understood thing that is a real problem that people have. The problem is that as soon as we start designing ways to talk about this in Gateway API, like, we run square into but you can also use that to describe a lot of the stuff that we want to do with Gamma. So I think that for this to be something that we need to do, we need to design something that's relatively tightly scoped, to doing the straight ingress use cases, that figures out a way that we handle this for the straight ingress use cases, and that we are clear this is for this use case where the pod is the process that's running inside the pod has its own cert that is managed in some other way that we don't care about, but the gateway needs to know that it needs to do TLS to talk to the backend service. That's the thing that we need to handle here. There are really two use cases there. One is TLS route, like the gateway doesn't unwrap the HTTP route and rewrap it. The other one is a subset of HTTP route where it does terminate the TLS traffic and then want to re-encrypt it. That's what we mean by re-encrypt. And I think that's the thing that we just need to be super clear on, that we're going to build something that is for those specific ingress use cases and not for handling all of the different permutations that that could be required for Gamma use cases.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So I think we're narrowing down the use case, the use cases. We have a slightly clearer idea of what we need to configure. What are the things that we need to do to actually move this forward?
I think we're gonna need effectively to. I think we should mark the 1282 GEP, the backend properties GEP, as declined, or whatever the status is called. We should start a new one that is ingress specific, TLS re-encryption or something like that. And then and then we need to figure out how we're going to do that. Someone in one of the in the use cases doc raised the possibility of using a filter, which is like maybe that would be a good place to hang that sort of thing, where we could add it in as sort of an alpha thing that would be it's very clear that it's alpha, because you're using the sort of the filter extension point rather than adding in stanzas. And then we consider if we make that, if we make the filter into a standard filter, that is definitely one way we could do it. Otherwise would be that we add stuff to the back end, the actual back end stanza, to sort of say, use TLS to this back end or something like that. The problem is that use TLS to this back end then has crossover into Gamma, because we're using the same resource for both, and we need to be specific about, hey, if we add those things in, then you say that doesn't work for Gamma use cases or something. So that's going to apply for either way. But basically the next steps are come up with some proposals and have people have a think about them, I think.
Okay. It feels like maybe we should start the new gap before we completely give up on the old gap, just in case the new gap ends up looking like it probably will be different. But maybe if we have an idea, if we have a compelling plan forward, then it's easier to just decline the old one when we clearly know we have a better way. But that all makes sense to me. Is there anyone who's currently or working on that or planning on working on that? Should we create an issue to track this stuff?
Sorry, you go, Candace.
There is an original issue. I don't want to get like completely far away. I don't want to completely ignore the original issue that I started with, which is specifically for re-encrypt. We kind of expanded it to do backend properties more generically, rather than just properties for re-encrypt. And now I think we want to go back and not do backend properties in a generic way, but specifically, what is the set of things that we're talking about here, other than re-encrypt? I think you said two things, Nick. So it's re-encrypt, but it's also, there was also something else that you mentioned.
So I think, when you're talking about re-encrypt, you need to consider what settings might the gateway as a TLS client need. So if the gateway's data path is being a TLS client, it needs to know, it may need a CA, it may need to know to have some, it may need to have its own client cert, and that a lot of the complexities around how you handle, like, do you allow or force the gateway data path to have a client cert per route backend, or one global one, or a few other things like that. So yeah, there's a bit of design in there that's like, once you say the gateway data path is now, so I'm using data path because I don't want to say proxy because not everyone has one. The data plane for the gateway, once it's a TLS client, you need to be able to configure that TLS client. There's a few other things that we talked about in the TLS use cases doc that we are leaving on the table by focusing tightly in on that. Things like TLS minimum versions, other stuff that we talked about in the backend properties thing, like what paths WebSockets is enabled on, and some other things like that. What paths should the gateway's data plane allow to handle the WebSocket upgrade and things like that. But I think that a lot of those are going to be relevant in the Gamma use cases as well. So so it's probably better to deal with those in a sort of more holistic way and pull this use case out and just be like, let's address this one, and then maybe it'll give us some patterns for handling some of those other things in the future.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I do want to move on because we do have a few other things on the list, but just is there anything we can do to make sure we don't lose this context? I guess they're
On-
already, it sounds like, go ahead.
It's on my to-do list, or like my to keep an eye on list. That's why I've been poking at the TLS use cases doc. But to make 100% sure that we don't do that, like that's why I proposed making a new gap issue. So Candace, we already have the sort of the feature request issue that you logged ages ago. But I think that it would be good to have a new gap issue that is a gap that is tightly scoped to create a solution for ingress TLS re-encrypt. And that, basically, and then maybe we add some stuff about TLS route and how you handle some of those things. But the core use case here we're dealing with is TLS unencrypt re-encrypt at the gateway level, and make sure that we're tightly scoping it to just ingress, so that we can ensure that we're clear that this is not about the gamma stuff. So I think that's probably the next step is for one of us to create that. Candace, if you want to do that, that's cool. Otherwise, if you don't, I'm happy to do it.
I can take a look at it.
So Bowie makes the point that that we shouldn't call it re-encrypt because this could also be an upgrade feature. We should be relatively, so it could be that you get plain text HTTP in and you get HTTPS out. But so so this is about gateway data plane as a TLS client, effectively being able to configure gateway data plane as a TLS client to a backend service for ingress traffic.
HTTPS as well as TCPS, right? So you don't have to terminate at the HTTP level. You could terminate just at TCP and transform either way.
I think so. That's something, we definitely need to think about. I think so. Because it's only about the TLS layer, we shouldn't be using any TLS specific things there. Yeah, you're right.
It's a popular paradigm in the load balancing world.
Yeah, I understand. It's just, I don't think the main use case, like the first use case we want to hit is the HTTPS, is the gateway encrypting HTTP traffics into HTTPS. But you're right, we should try and ensure that we don't rule out generic TLS stream when we do the design.
I do want to do a time check here. We've got a few other things to get through.
All right.
The great discussion. I think we have clear follow-ups here, and hopefully this means we'll have lots of good discussion on a focused gap. Would love to see that move forward. Thank you to everyone for the patience as we've kind of gone back and forth on this, but hopefully we'll find the right variation here sometime soon. Next up, policy attachment. Out of curiosity, how many implementations are using or working on something that would use the Gateway API policy attachment model? Maybe this is another one where I need, go ahead, Shane, or is that just a yes?
It's a yes. I don't have
Okay.
like a ton of details, but definitely
I know
policy attachment for a few things.
Yeah, and I know we already support that in GKE, so I'll just I can't type today. Anyone else, feel free to add yourself there. I am trying to find what it takes to move.
I have an open PR actually to add some extra wording to that.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, I need to. That's on me. I need to get back to that. Thank you.
Yeah. So there is an open PR that adds a bunch of language to that sort of clarifies a few things and makes clear a couple of other things that are not currently clear. It actually reverses one thing that is in there that says that you can't do custom filters and policy attachment at the same time. I think that one was a thing that we put in when we first thinking about this, but I think that's a mistake. And the policy attachment is actually one of the best ways, if you are doing custom filters, to be able to configure those, to be able to sort of do a higher layer configuration of a custom filter. Let me find
interesting. Okay. Okay, yeah, I will follow up with that. I do remember that. It's been ages since I've taken a look. I am interested in moving this one forward. It's still labeled as alpha. This is not a resource itself. It is just a set of types really in a pattern.
It's a pattern, really. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think until we
and-
have some better examples of implementations doing it, then it will remain so. It has been on my wish list for a long time to have a sort of included in the API one that we or some some reference in the docs to some relatively standard or like good implementations of this API, but that requires people to actually do implementations of the API. The one I wanted to do, which I was considering doing for Envoy Gateway, is an Envoy timeout policy, because as we said, timeout policy is really hard to do and basically requires something like policy attachment. Sadly, I've had a number of discussions with people that are like, surely it's not that difficult. And I'm like, trust me, Rob and I spent weeks trying to make something work and we couldn't. So yeah, I think so there's definitely, that's what I'd like to see eventually, is that page have, not only sort of here's generically how you use it, but also some links to say, here are some implementations of this to give you some ideas about what this looks like. But the other thing that's included in that update is an update to the language that makes clear that policy attachment is a type of meta resource. A meta resource is a resource that modifies or alters or enhances the functionality of another resource. Reference grant is another example. And so just to make that language a little bit clearer, because I think that people using policy attachment and the policy attachment part in my mind is about the hierarchy and cascading down the hierarchy. Defining a policy at gateway, having it apply to routes is what policy attachment is really about. So so that's why I wanted to make that update. Anyway.
Well, I will definitely add that to my list to try and review it this week. Thank you. We ran out of time for the rest of the route types here. But I know, Candace, thank you. Your conformance tests have already merged. That was one of the biggest blockers for TLS route. I think a lot of these we're just going to also be asking for what implementations out there are already supporting TLS route. Until we have centralized conformance reporting, the best thing we can do, I think, is just ask in Slack or GitHub and try and, standardize centralize the responses there. That's probably the trickiest part of our, graduation beyond alpha right now, but TLS route feels like the next closest thing at this point, and then the rest are all a little bit further off, but excited for Bleakst, and hopefully that'll help us move through these. We are at time, so I want to be recognize that, but there are pull requests that could use review. I've been a little underwater, but am hoping to get through some of these. But if anyone else has time, other reviews are very, very welcome. With that, any last things before we close off? Great. Have a good rest of your week, everyone. And some of you will see you for a Gamma meeting tomorrow. Have a great one.